Harold II, was the last Anglo-Saxon King of England. Harold reigned from January 6, 1066 until his death at the Battle of Hastings on October 14, fighting the Norman invaders led by William the Conqueror during the Norman conquest of England. His death marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule over England. Harold was a powerful earl and member of a prominent Anglo-Saxon family with ties to King Cnut. Upon the death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066, the Witenagemot convened and chose Harold to succeed. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey. In late September he successfully repulsed an invasion by rival claimant Harold Hardrada of Norway, before marching his army back south to meet William the Conqueror at Hastings some 2 weeks later. Family background: Harold was a son of Godwin, the powerful Earl of Wessex, and Gwythyr Thorkelstr, sister-in-law of King Cnut the Great of England and Denmark. Gwythyr's brother was Ulfgel, who was married to Cnut's sister Estrith. This made Ulf the son-in-law of King Cnut Forkbeard, and the father of King Cnut II of Denmark. Godwin was the son of Wulfnoth, probably a Finn and a native of Sussex. Godwin remained an earl throughout Cnut's reign, one of only 2 earls to survive to the end of Cnut's reign. On Cnut's death, Godwin originally supported Hardrada instead of Cnut's initial successor Harold Harefoot, but managed to switch sides in 1037, although not without becoming involved in the murder of Alfred Aetheling, half-brother of Hardrada and younger brother of the later King Edward the Confessor. When Harold Harefoot died, Hardrada became king and Godwin's power was imperiled by his earlier involvement in Alfred's murder, but an oath and large gift secured the new king's favour for Godwin. Hardrada's death in 1042 likely involved Godwin in a role as kingmaker, helping to secure the English throne for Edward the Confessor. In 1045, Godwin was at the height of his power, when his daughter Edith was married to the king. Godwin and Gwythyr had several children. The sons were Cwyn, Harold, Tostig, Gith, Leofwine, and Wulfnoth. There were also 3 daughters: Edith of Wessex, originally named Gwythyr but renamed Ealdgyth when she married King Edward the Confessor, Gunhild, and Lfgifu. The birth dates of the children are unknown, but Cwyn was the eldest and Harold was the second son. Harold was aged about 25 in 1045, which makes his birth date around 1020. Powerful nobleman, Edith married Edward on January 23, 1045, and around that time Harold became Earl of East Anglia. Harold is called Earl when he appears as a witness in a will that may date to 1044, but by 1045 Harold regularly appears as an Earl in documents. One reason for his appointment to East Anglia may have been a need to defend against the threat from King Magnus the Good of Norway. It is possible that Harold led some of the ships from his earldom that were sent to Sandwich in 1045 against Magnus. Cwyn, Harold's elder brother, had been named an earl in 1043. It was also around the time that Harold was named an earl that he began a relationship with Edith, who appears to have been the heiress to lands in Cambridgeshire, Suffolk and Essex, lands in Harold's new earldom. The relationship was a form of marriage that was not blessed or sanctioned by the Church, known as Mordanico, or in the Danish manner, and was accepted by most lay people in England at the time. Any children of such a union were considered legitimate. Harold likely entered the relationship in part to secure support in his new earldom. In 1047 Harold's elder brother Cwyn was exiled after abducting the Abbess of Leominster. Cwyn's lands were divided between Harold and a cousin, Bjorn. In 1049, Harold was in command of a ship or ships that were sent with a fleet to aid the German Emperor Henry III against Count Baldwin V of Flanders, who was in revolt against Henry. During this campaign, Cwyn returned to England and attempted to secure a pardon from the king, but Harold and Bjorn refused to return any of their lands, and Cwyn, after leaving the royal court, took Bjorn hostage and later killed him. When in 1051 Earl Godwin was sent into exile, Harold accompanied his father and helped him to regain his position a year later. Then Godwin died in 1053, and Harold succeeded him as Earl of Wessex. This arguably made him the most powerful figure in England after the king. In 1058, Harold also became Earl of Hereford and replaced his late father as the focus of opposition to growing Norman influence in England under the restored monarchy of Edward the Confessor, who had spent more than 25 years in exile in Normandy. He led a series of successful campaigns against Gruffydd ap Llywelyn of Gwynedd, the ruler of Wales. This conflict ended with Gruffydd's defeat and death in 1063. Harold in northern France. In 1064, Harold apparently was shipwrecked at Ponthieu. There is much speculation about this voyage. The earliest post-conquest Norman chroniclers report that King Edward had previously sent Robert, Archbishop of Canterbury, to appoint as his heir Edward's maternal kinsman, William of Normandy, and that at this later date Harold was sent to swear fealty. Scholars disagree as to the reliability of this story. William, at least, seems to have believed he had been offered the succession, but there must have been some confusion either on William's part or perhaps by both men, since the English succession was neither inherited nor determined by the reigning monarch. Instead, the Witenagemot, the assembly of the kingdom's leading notables, would convene after a king's death to select a successor. Other acts of Edward are inconsistent with his having made such a promise, such as his efforts to return his nephew Edward the Exile, son of King Edmund Ironside, from Hungary in 1057. Later Norman chroniclers suggest alternative explanations for Harold's journey, that he was seeking the release of members of his family who had been held hostage since Godwin's exile in 1051, or even that he had simply been travelling along the English coast on a hunting and fishing expedition and had been driven across the Channel by an unexpected storm. There is general agreement that he left from Bosham, and was blown off course, landing at Ponthieu. He was captured by Count Guy of Ponthieu, and was then taken as a hostage to the Count's castle at Birain, 24.5 km up the River Cank from its mouth at what is now Le Churquet. Duke William arrived soon afterward and ordered Guy to turn Harold over to him. Harold then apparently accompanied William to battle against William's enemy, Conan II, Duke of Brittany. While crossing into Brittany past the fortified abbey of the Mont Saint-Michel, Harold is recorded as rescuing two of William's soldiers from quicksand. They pursued Conan from Dol de Breton to Rennes, and finally to Dinan, where he surrendered the fortress's keys at the point of a lance. William presented Harold with weapons and arms, knighting him. The Bailly Tapestry, and other Norman sources, then record that Harold swore an oath on sacred relics to William to support his claim to the English throne. After Edward's death, the Normans were quick to point out that in accepting the crown of England, Harold had broken this alleged oath. The chronicler Audric Vitalis wrote of Harold that he was very tall and handsome, remarkable for his physical strength, his courage and eloquence, his ready jests and acts of valor. But what were these gifts to him without honor, which is the root of all good? Due to a doubling of taxation by Tostig in 1065 that threatened to plunge England into civil war, Harold supported Northumbrian rebels against his brother, Tostig, and replaced him with Morcar. This strengthened his acceptability as Edward's successor, but fatally split his own family, driving Tostig into alliance with King Harold Hardrada of Norway. Marriages and children. For some 20 years Harold was married Mordanico to Edith Swanesha and had at least 6 children with her. The marriage was widely accepted by the laity, although Edith was considered Harold's mistress by the clergy. According to Audric Vitalis, Harold was at some time betrothed to Adeliza, a daughter of William, Duke of Normandy, later William the Conqueror. If so, the betrothal never led to marriage. About January 1066, Harold married Edith, daughter of Lfgar, Earl of Mercia, and widow of the Welsh prince Gruffydd ap Llywelyn. Edith had 2 sons possibly twins named Harold and Iwlf, both of whom survived into adulthood and probably lived out their lives in exile. After her husband's death, Edith is said to have fled for refuge to her brothers, Edwin, Earl of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, but both men made their peace with King William initially before rebelling and losing their lands and lives. Edith may have fled abroad. Harold's sons, Godwin and Edmund, fled to Ireland and then invaded Devon, but were defeated by Brian of Brittany. Family tree, reign as king. At the end of 1065, King Edward the Confessor fell into a coma without clarifying his preference for the succession. He died on January 5, 1066, according to the Vita Edwardi Regis, but not before briefly regaining consciousness and commending his widow and the kingdom to Harold's protection. The intent of this charge is ambiguous, as is the Bailly tapestry, which simply depicts Edward pointing at a man thought to represent Harold. When the Witenagemot convened the next day, they selected Harold to succeed, and his coronation followed on January 6, most likely held in Westminster Abbey. However, there is no surviving evidence from the time to confirm this. Although later Norman sources point to the suddenness of this coronation, the reason may have been that all the nobles of the land were present at Westminster for the Feast of Epiphany, and not because of any usurpation of the throne on Harold's part. In early January 1066, hearing that Harold had been crowned, Duke William II of Normandy began plans to invade by building 700 warships and transports at Dives-sur-Mer on the Normandy coast. Initially, William could not get support for the invasion but, claiming that Harold had sworn on sacred relics to support his claim to the throne after having been shipwrecked at Ponthieu, William was given the church's blessing and nobles flocked to his cause. In anticipation of the invasion, Harold assembled his troops on the Isle of Wight, but the invasion fleet remained in port for almost 7 months, perhaps due to unfavourable winds. On September 8, with provisions running out, Harold disbanded the army and returned to London. On the same day Harold Hardrada of Norway, who also claimed the English crown, joined Tostig and invaded, landing his fleet at the mouth of the Tyne. The invading forces of Hardrada and Tostig defeated the English earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, at the Battle of Fulford near York on September 20. They in turn were defeated and slain by Harold's army 5 days later at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold having led his army north on a forced march from London in 4 days and catching them by surprise. According to Snorri Sturluson, before the battle a man bravely rode up to Harold Hardrada and Tostig and offered Tostig his earldom if he would but turn on Harold Hardrada. When Tostig asked what his brother Harold would be willing to give Harold Hardrada for his trouble, the rider replied that he would be given 7 feet of ground as he was taller than other men. Harold Hardrada was impressed with the rider and asked Tostig his name. Tostig replied that the rider was none other than Harold Godwinson. According to Henry of Huntingdon, 6 feet of ground or as much more as he needs, as he is taller than most men, was Harold's response. It is, however, unknown whether this conversation ever took place. Battle of Hastings. On September 12 William's fleet sailed. Several ships sank in storms, and the fleet was forced to take shelter at St. Valery-sur-Somme and wait for the wind to change. On September 27 the Norman fleet finally set sail for England, arriving, it is believed, the following day at Pevensey on the coast of East Sussex. Harold's army marched 241 miles to intercept William, who had landed perhaps 7,000 men in Sussex, southern England. Harold established his army in hastily built earthworks near Hastings. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Hastings, at Senlac Hill close by Hastings on October 14, where after 9 hours of hard fighting and probably less than 30 minutes from victory, Harold was killed and his forces routed. His brothers Gith and Leofwine were also killed in the battle. Death. The account of the battle, Carmen de Hastem Gabrielio, said to have been written shortly after the battle by Guy, Bishop of Amiens, says that Harold was killed by 4 knights, probably including Duke William, and his body brutally dismembered. Amatus of the Monte Cassino's L'Histoire de l'Île Normand, written 30 years after the Battle of Hastings, is the first report of Harold being shot in the eye with an arrow. Later accounts reflect one or both of these two versions. A figure in the panel of the Bailly tapestry with the inscription Harold Rex Interfectus Estate is depicted gripping an arrow that has struck his eye, but some historians have questioned whether this man is intended to be Harold, or if Harold is intended as the next figure lying to the right almost prone, being mutilated beneath a horse's hooves. Etchings made of the tapestry in the 1730s show the standing figure with differing objects. In our registered trademark T's 1729 sketch shows only a dotted line indicating stitch marks without any indication of fletching. Bernard de Montfaucon's 1730 engraving has a solid line resembling a spear being held overhand matching the manner of the figure to the left. Stothard's 1819 watercolor drawing has, for the first time, a fletched arrow in the figure's eye. Although not apparent in the earlier depictions, the tapestry today has stitch marks indicating the fallen figure once had an arrow in its eye. It has been proposed that the second figure once had an arrow added by over-enthusiastic 19th-century restorers that was later unstitched. A further suggestion is that both accounts are accurate, and that Harold suffered first the eye wound, then the mutilation, and the tapestry is depicting both in sequence. Burial and legacy. The account of the contemporary chronicler William of Poitiers states that the body of Harold was given to William Mellot for burial. The two brothers of the king were found near him, and Harold himself, stripped of all badges of honor, could not be identified by his face but only by certain marks on his body. His corpse was brought into the Duke's camp, and William gave it for burial to William, surnamed Mellot, and not to Harold's mother, who offered for the body of her beloved son its weight in gold. For the Duke thought it unseemly to receive money for such merchandise, and equally he considered it wrong that Harold should be buried as his mother wished, since so many men lay unburied because of his avarice. They said in jest that he who had guarded the coast with such insensate zeal should be buried by the seashore. Another source states that Harold's widow, Edith Swanesha, was called to identify the body, which she did by some private mark known only to her. Harold's strong association with Bosham, his birthplace, and the discovery in 1954 of an Anglo-Saxon coffin in the church there, has led some to suggest it as the place of King Harold's burial. A request to exhume a grave in Bosham Church was refused by the Diocese of Chichester in December 2003, the Chancellor having ruled that the chances of establishing the identity of the body as Harold's were too slim to justify disturbing a burial place. A prior exhumation had revealed the remains of a man, estimated at up to 60 years of age from photographs of the remains, lacking a head, one leg and the lower part of his other leg, a description consistent with the fate of the king as recorded in the Carmen. The poem also claims Harold was buried by the sea, which is consistent with William of Poitiers' account and with the identification of the grave at Bosham Church that is only yards from Chichester Harbour and in sight of the English Channel. There were legends of Harold's body being given a proper funeral years later in his church of Waltham Holy Cross in Essex, which he had refounded in 1060. Legends grew up that Harold had not died at Hastings but instead fled England, or that he later ended his life as a hermit at Chester or Canterbury. Harold's son Eulf, along with Morcar and two others, were released from prison by King William as he lay dying in 1087. Eulf threw his lot in with Robert Curthose, who knighted him, and then disappeared from history. Two of Harold's other sons, Godwin and Edmund, invaded England in 1068 and 1069 with the aid of Diarmait Mac Mael na Embo. They raided Cornwall as late as 1082, but died in obscurity in Ireland. Ancestry, references, notes. Footnotes. Citations. External links. In the Footsteps of King Harold, a timeline of Harold Godwinson's life, includes information about places significant to Harold II's story. BBC Historic Figures, Harold II, Portraits of King Harold II at the National Portrait Gallery, London.